Now,
So let me just ask you
please.
something. Like, for instance, if you take a song like the army goes rolling along, over hill, over dale, as we hit the dusty trail. Is the way that you relate to that is 1 2 1 2
Yes.
1 2, not 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1.
Correct. Correct.
Okay, so dun 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 dun. I mean, I perceive that as directing it. I'd be directing it like this: dun 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 dun.
And what you're
Or
doing is you're conducting in two.
yeah,
And the reason that
you can also conduct it in four. Hill over dale, you can hit the dusty trail.
right, but the difference is this: you're now what you're doing is you're distinguishing between duple meter and quadruple meter. So let's take care of that next, because duple meter and quadruple meter. Now you fortunately gave us an example that really kind of urges the composer to conduct or the conductor to conduct in duple meter, even though the caissons could be in four. That's a good example because that's actually a marching tune, and marching is typically done in two, not in four. But the other significance of marching is this. Um, the implication that you just gave in the tune that you represented is that there's an implied accent after a bar line. So, and your conducting should reflect that. So the difference in duple versus quadruple, da-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-da bum bum. There happens to be a pickup note in that note, in that tune, which I didn't notate here. Over is a pickup note. But when I say hill, over hill, over dale, we will hit trail. The reason that's such a good example is because it would be hard for someone to argue that those four words aren't accented. Now let's just for fun kick over to, I'm going to change this to what we would call a quadruple meter, four somethings. We could go through the whole explanation about how it could be four anythings, four eighth notes, four 16th notes, but the same principle would just transfer into fours as it did in twos. So we don't really need to do that. But let's go ahead and change it to 4/4. And what happens in 4/4 is that accent, which was on
it's got to be on all the notes.
No, hold on a second. It carried over from what I had before, but it says over hill, over dale. If I take that out, interesting. I'm just going to delete that symbol. What we're saying now, if we were to write the caissons in 4/4 time, now you could always write in accents like that, and you could create. What this is doing here, in this particular example is simulating duple meter by putting an accent on beat 3, and that is another option that composers can do by writing in an accent where it wouldn't naturally occur. But what I would have to do if I were following this as notated is I would have to say, over hill, over dale, we will hit. So I would have to remove the accent off of the word dale. Over hill, over dale, we will, and then hit would come back with an accent. Over hill, over dale, we would hit. There's really nothing extremely wrong with that. It's just that there's a subtlety that's missing. Over hill, over dale. Your marching group wouldn't maybe get off step because you have less reference points with which to march. So a march is better off in a duple meter, where another tune we'll look at in the next segment might be more conducive to quadruple. Okay, let's try and think of a tune that would be a good example of quadruple meter.
Off we go into the wild blue yonder.
There you go. Now, the reason that's such a good example is because of wild blue yonder. You have four events that don't want to be interrupted. You wouldn't want to say, wild blue yonder. Again, it's subtle. You could. You probably wouldn't be booed off the stage if you perform that way, but that's not, you'd be going against the natural grain of what America the Beautiful is another, oh, oh, beautiful for Spain. Right, you wouldn't want to say, oh, beautiful. That wouldn't make sense. So that's the inherent difference between duple and quadruple. The point that you've highlighted here, whether on purpose or not, though, is that sometimes the difference between a duple meter and a quadruple meter, 2 versus 4, is subtle. The groupings may not be that obvious. And one of the fun games that composers love to play is to write music that isn't really quite as obvious. You know, you might be interested in sitting down as a composer and thinking, well, how can I write a tune that maybe crosses over, and in one measure it really begs for quadruple notation, and then in another measure it hints at duple, but I'm just borrowing that division, so I'm going to write in an accent on B2. And that's what we have here. In this case, it would be bum, 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 bum. So another way that you could do this, which probably wouldn't be recommended, it would be probably more cumbersome than necessary, though, but you could change measure 2 to be 2-4,
Mm-hmm.
and that can happen.
Typically, in most of the music I've seen, the kind of choral music I've seen, they'll go ahead and do it that way, just because they want you to be so sure that the meter is changing, and they want to emphasize it.
And that would absolutely emphasize it. Where putting it back to the way it was before would imply but not emphasize. We're absolutely, I mean, there's no doubt that we're looking at very subtle shades of gray. You know, it's not cut and dry.
It's not so subtle shade of gray if you're singing a song, and that's the way the song is supposed to go.
Or a better example would be in the music of Stravinsky, where his whole focus might be on rhythm in a certain passage, and he might want you to hear, and I mean, he'll accent these hits with not only a little note accent on a note, but a percussion instrument will slam down at that moment. I mean, he'll really nail that idea to the wall. And so in music, you can go from a very subtle shading of this, and in an extreme opposite example, a pianist playing in 4/4 time might infuse that accent even though the composer didn't put it there, just to interpret the music in their own way. It might be a jazz or a rock musician who wants to take a Beethoven piece, where Beethoven might want a long legato melody, and this maverick player might decide, oh, I want to put an accent there. It might be conscious, it might be intuitive, but all of these things are subtle shades of meter that we deal with in music all the time. However, you can see that there are at least 2 or 3 different ways to tweak what you see in relation to what you hear. And the most, I think, basic principle that we've seen is simply the choice of 2/4 versus 4/4. So we saw 2 very elementary examples of why you would be compelled to choose one, even though you could still write caissons in 4/4, or you could write America the Beautiful in 2/4. It would be going against the grain of what the natural phrase wants you to feel.